is Way Up with Angela Yee. I'm Angela Yee on a Wealth Wednesday, and my Wealth Wednesday partner, Stacey Tisdale, is here.
Happy Wealth Wednesdays! We are so excited. You sit down and enjoy the conversation that's about to come to you with Dr. Rob Gore.
Right.
Oh, thanks for having me today.
Listen, we just had a conversation. We went to the same elementary school, and so we were there at the same time for sure. Shout out to everybody from PS 235 in Brooklyn. But I just found this out. But as I've been reading your book, Treating Violence, and a lot of the different schools that you talk about in neighborhoods are obviously ones I'm familiar with. So I was like, I wonder. You went to Bishop Loughlin?
Yeah, I went to Bishop Loughlin.
Philippa Schuyler?
Philippa Schuyler. And 230 Learning is Alive at PS 235.
I know that's right.
Yeah.
Brooklyn is all up in this house today.
Yeah, no, we're definitely here.
But the reason why this is a Wealth Wednesday is because when it comes to treating violence, you work in the emergency room. A lot of what happens with our youth can be traced back to trauma they've had as a child, things that, I always hate to say things are generational, but things do get passed down. A lot of it have to do with the influences and how we grew up and opportunities that we have, our environments. And so this is just something that I want to make sure we talk about because it's such an important topic.
You have an entirely different approach to trauma and violence from your personal experience, that it should be treated and not incarcerated. And tell us a little bit about how that all happened.
So I've been an emergency physician. This is year 22 since I finished medical school. And being somebody who grew up in the community with people of color and practicing medicine, emergency medicine, and with populations who are also of color, things start to resonate a little bit differently. And when you start seeing people coming into the hospital with repeat injuries and repeat conditions, you have to start asking yourself why. And when they are somehow connected to you directly, whether it's a family member or a neighbor or somebody that you've seen before, you really have to start asking yourself why, because now this experience of what they've gone through has become personal. And if there's a connection with you as a care provider and that patient on a very different level, they're going to ask you questions that are a little bit different than somebody who doesn't necessarily understand their culture and understand their language and how they move or even their community. And I started looking at a lot of the repeat cases that were coming into the hospital. I did my residency at Cook County Hospital on the west side of Chicago, and my family is also from the west side of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And, so I always wondered when patients were coming in, were they going to be one of my cousins? If I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time, where I lived on the south side of Chicago, could I be one of these patients who were coming in with some sort of injury? And would the people I work with be really excited because they got to do a procedure on me? Or do we start coming up with ways to make sure that people didn't come back? And so I began looking at violence and trauma through a lens of public health, meaning that if we understand the risk factors, if we understand the conditions, kind of like our conversation earlier today, if we understand the conditions in which people come from, if we can help tweak those and modify or at least provide levels of support for those conditions, then we can change the scope of violence and particularly recurrent violence.
There's an economic connection here. We were talking about that. A lot of people don't connect the dots. I remember did a big profile piece on the economics of riots and trauma and violence, and a lot of that just has to do with our socioeconomic condition.
You're 100% correct. So there's no surprise that the communities that have the highest amounts of interpersonal violence are also those which are the most impoverished. You might even see where there's a sharp demarcation between those who have and those who don't have. You wind up seeing major amounts of economic disparities. And when you can visually see that somebody has affluence and access to resources in one particular area and you can't have access to that, that creates a dichotomy. These same areas are also the areas, at least like in New York City, are the areas where you have the highest number of new HIV cases, the highest number of untreated hypertension, untreated diabetes, any health condition possible, you're going to wind up seeing in those areas that are impoverished. It doesn't mean that other communities don't experience this kind of stuff, but there's a different kind of checks and balances. There's a difference in distribution of wealth and distribution of resource and even just the accessibility of those resources to ensure that your well-being is maintained. When you don't have food, when you don't know where you're going to live, when every aspect of your body is disrupted because you are purely in survival mode and your nervous system is dysregulated, how can you function? You're not going to interpret things the same way. And because of all these conditions, things are just kind of growing in way. It's not just you, it's your whole family. So if your family is dysregulated because they don't have enough things for them to be able to survive, how are you going to function? Your support system is out of whack, and this cycle and these conditions kind of perpetuate themselves purely because of that environment.
And you do look at things from that point of view. In the book, you talk about a situation where you got jumped. And that's scary, like when you get jumped and then now I have to go still walk to school or go wherever I have to go. That person knows me. It could happen again. And now you're thinking I got to walk with a weapon just in case something happens. But then you also later on were able to give grace because things could have went a whole nother way. So can you just talk about that and the whole thinking behind, okay, this happened to me, but I can see where that person was coming from also.
You said something just now. You said when you get jumped. And it's not like if. You said when. Because we grew up here, and
you're going to get jumped at some point.
You're going to get jumped. You're going to get chased. And there are many people from, some of my colleagues who never had this experience at all. They've been bullied before, but that's a very different kind of thing. But to be in a space, and we went to schools that there were a lot of major support systems. From our elementary school, both of our respective junior high schools and high schools had high amounts of support. But what happens when you're not in that environment? The environment's not as forgiving. And your job as a kid growing up in Brooklyn or New York or any place where has a reputation for being tough, you just got to get home. Once you get in school, I shouldn't say once you. Some people, when they get in school, they look at that as a safe space and a place where they're given the ability to be brave and to be able to talk about things that they're experiencing. But not everybody has that opportunity. And if anything threatens your life and well-being, you go into protective mode. And protective mode means you have to stay alive, and that's carrying weapons. That's joining a gang. That's what we call back then. They call them posses at some point because of the Caribbean influence. But you just wanted to surround yourself with people who could help protect you to ensure that your survivability was maintained. And I got jumped when I was like 11 years old. I wasn't the first in my friends to get jumped, but I grew up across the street from public housing in Fort Greene. And a lot of things happening in the 80s and 90s. People are trying to be tough. People are trying to get money. And I got jumped by two guys that were probably a little bit older than me, and they stole my bus pass and the $1 that I had in my pocket. And although it wasn't a whole lot of money, it's terrifying to be in a place that you felt safe. And I was just at the corner of my block, just leaving right. I think I just left the bodega, and just turning the corner, and all of a sudden my entire world changed. And I started carrying razor blades and screwdrivers, and I carried hammers. I never carried guns.
Right, at 11 years old.
This is 11, and I went to the nerdy school.
Right.
We were Philippa Schuyler Middle School for the gifted and talented, and people don't assume that because of the environment that they kind of associate you with, they don't assume
you still have to get home.
You still got to get home, and the neighborhoods haven't completely changed. Once you're in your house, I felt safe. Well, once we were in our apartment, I felt safe. But even for a lot of some of our peers, not even some of them have felt safe in their own homes. And so what does that do to your entire psyche? You're always in this protective mode. And,
always flight or flight.
Always fight or flight, which causes your stress hormones to go up. There are a series of studies that talk about adverse childhood experiences, and when they talk about stress hormones, and these things impact your immune system. So if you're constantly stressed in fight or flight, you don't fight off infection well. But people who experience a lot of adverse childhood experiences have increased. They have earlier deaths. They are more prone to develop autoimmune problems. They're more prone to develop heart disease, and unfortunately, they're more prone to develop early death, purely because of this repeated trauma that they experience without having any period to really process it.
So that's why you're really focused on let's fix the trauma response, which you don't feel incarceration is the answer to.
No, incarceration is a containment model which doesn't allow for people to access the proper amount of resources that are required to regulate your nervous system and regulate your physical body. There's no rehabilitation that takes place. We know of the success stories that come out of the justice impacted system, or people who have been justice impacted, but we don't hear the majority of the people who enter that system. And if you consider how many people who have been incarcerated, who've also experienced deep-seated trauma, that have never gotten an opportunity to be able to process that stuff with somebody who's a trained professional that understands their community, their environment, and how to access those resources for people who may not completely be open to that, and families, you might have a very different situation, but that's not the norm. And so we've got to start looking at this stuff through a very protective lens, through a very preventative lens, because prevention is a lot cheaper than paying for emergencies.
I mean, it is and I think about like prison, and we talk about this a lot, how it is a business too. And
Huge.
so a lot of times when we talk about preventative methods, for some people, they don't necessarily want that. That's
We hear all those stories.
pretty much
they
free
start
labor.
building cells for black boys,
Yeah,
like when they're born.
Yeah, they start. I think it's when they're based on their third grade reading scores or something. Don't quote me on that one, but I think it's based on something that happens at under the age of 8, and that's what they determine. So you already know there's big business out there, and so how do we do these things that are preventative and allow communities to really thrive? I speak about this a lot whenever I speak. I talk about social determinants of health, which are the things that impact our health and well-being. And this is anywhere from economic development, like you speak about, regularly throughout your career, and empowering other people to make sure that there's a level of economic independence and development. Those are protective factors that ensure that people at least have access to certain resources to help fund things that can help improve their well-being. Having more than adequate, having really proficient and really supportive social systems is another protective factor. But accessibility to education, accessibility to economic development, accessibility to food and nutrition are all things that can impact your well-being. And when you don't have those things, this kind of comes back to what we were speaking about before, the stress levels that continue to go up. And we think about stress as like, oh, I'm stressed, I just need to chill out. No, but chronic stress screws with you. It impacts every aspect of your life and all the other people who are connected to you. And you spoke a little bit earlier about trauma that gets passed down. So if you're coming from a household where your grandmother was physically abused, sexually abused, and mishandled and mistreated in so many ways that we couldn't even fathom, what stuff gets passed on to their offspring, who's your mother or your caretaker. And if that person has also experienced deep-seated trauma and deep-seated emotional and physical dysregulation, and then they have a child, what happens? I was on the phone with an attorney friend, and they were speaking about a case. They were trying to find out how they could get some sort of support for a young person that had committed a crime. And when they told the background story of this young person, the young person had experienced great deals of sexual trauma as a young child, and not having a great support system with the parent and with the other care providers. It doesn't mean they weren't present, but they just didn't have the tools because there were other issues that had taken place in that parent's household that would cause them to have a minimal support system. And so now this kid is up for charges and is not able, it's like, first of all, why did he even get to this point to begin with?
Right.
But if you look at the background story and all the different series of events that had taken place, it's not surprising. And so we're dealing with a young person who has been a victim of a failed system, really becoming from a deep-seated trauma that has been intergenerational.
It's untreated trauma.
It's untreated.
And we see that in finances. We talk a lot about financial abuse, which is a precursor to 99% of domestic violence cases. And you see so many people who are abusers were abused. People love how they were loved. So it's like breaking those cycles, which you're not just having your average conversation here. Dr. Gore was chosen as a presidential leadership scholar and created KAVI, which is supported by the George W. Bush and Clinton presidential centers. Brag about KAVI.
So actually, I one quick correction. So I was in the Presidential Leadership Scholars, which is it's like policy school and business school and leadership development all fused into like a 6-month block. And that was supported by the Clinton and Bush presidential libraries. KAVI itself is completely independent of them and don't receive financial contributions from them. But KAVI itself is a hospital, school, and community-based violence intervention and prevention program that I founded as a way to, or I should say we founded because I engaged so many different people within the community to provide this effort and provide these services, but really as a way to help young people understand and process trauma that they've experienced, and create resources so that violent trauma that people have experienced doesn't become recurrent.
And that's Kings Against Violence Initiative.
Yes,
just
Kings
so people
Against
know what
Violence
KAVI
Initiative.
stands for.
So you can check us out at kavibrooklyn.org.
It's interesting because in reading this book and hearing some of the individual people that have been through KAVI that you've helped, one story that you love is your success story. It was an immigrant, right, that you talk about in this book that had gotten stabbed,
Yes.
and then ended up as in your care. And then you did bring in KAVI, and it's kind of like is it what you call it, like an intervention?
It's an intervention.
Program?
Actually, even with KAVI, I should probably clarify a couple of things. So we were hospital, school, and community-based. The
Right.
school and community-based work to do more preventative work. And some of the community work also works with people who are very high risk, who've been impacted by violence. And so we actually provide some support services at Wyckoff houses and Gowanus houses, over in... I don't even know what section of Brooklyn that would be called anymore because everything is changing.
Yeah, I know. Who knows what?
But we provide support services for those communities over there, and then we do the intervention work for people who've been shot and stabbed and
Right.
injured due to violence who pass through Kings County Hospital Center, which is where I work as an emergency physician.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things is a lot of times that happens, and either you're scared that it's going to happen again and people are still looking for you, or you want to retaliate. Because I think initially people's first reaction is to want to get these people
Yes.
who did that to you. And that's important because that is definitely a cycle.
Revenge.
The revenge cycle is
So,
huge.
yeah, I want to talk about that for a second because it's really hard to talk somebody off the ledge when once they get out of here, the first thing they're thinking is, I'm going to get these people that did this to me.
So, the intervention that we provide, the first thing, I got to see the world through the eyes of an emergency physician. I also see it through the lens of a public health person. So the emergency side means we got to keep you alive, and we'll do whatever means possible to make sure that you are at least able to breathe on your own independently and walk out of the doors of the hospital or get wheeled out depending on the circumstances of the injury that had taken place. The public health lens is to ensure how do we make sure we create systems and at least help support systems that ensure your overall well-being and allow you to thrive. Your mental health services, your housing, accessibility to food, economic development, economic independence, anything that's going to allow you to be able to take care of yourself as independently or as interdependently as possible, rather than just relying on a system that is already overrun and is already busting at the seams. With the issue regarding retaliation, when people come in who've been injured due to violence, about maybe 40 to 50% are going to have repeat violent injuries within a 5-year time frame. 20 to 30% of those are going to be maybe killed. The rate is 20 to 30% for being killed after an incident of violence has occurred, which is crazy just to think about it. And then because a lot of these folks are our people, we are, our hospital and the community we work with are major populations of color, black, brown, indigenous individuals, and some poor whites, although those numbers are substantially lower. You have to keep asking yourself, why do these people keep coming back with these things? And at first it's almost, why do these people? But because some of the folks that, I work in a place where people from our neighborhood come to the hospital, people I grew up with come to the hospital. It's not a why do these people, it's why do our people? Because there's a deep-seated connection. And once you personalize trauma and once you personalize these connections, the things that you want to implement are going to be a little bit different. It's not just, how can I just provide a Band-Aid approach? How do I provide something that's going to be so transient that it checks off a box but doesn't have that same kind of impact? And so we've been looking at these really comprehensive services to really engage all community partners, from the people who are in the neighborhood and the communities we serve, as well as the hospital institution. Kings County Hospital has been a tremendous partner and has been supportive of the efforts that we've been providing. They also recognize that as a hospital entity alone, they can't do everything. We recognize as a community-based organization, we can't do everything. And so it's a matter of diversifying the different resources that are around us, from those in the government, those who are public, those who are private, as a way to really provide resources that have an ability to build capacity within the communities that are affected.
What role would financial literacy play in that equation in de-escalating violence?
Wow. I feel like I'm cheating because I had a conversation with you before about just finance. I'm so glad you plugged that in, and I thank you for the book as well. But but you mentioned that depression. Actually, I don't want to.
This is what I told him. I have a financial literacy foundation called Winning Plays. And it was piloted in high schools in New York, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and in Dallas, Texas. And then while it was being piloted, I snuck in the back of a classroom to watch a teacher teaching it. The lesson about gender, I have the kids start by looking at a case study of how a woman and a man are treated differently when they go to a car dealership. Easy for the kids to see. When women are going to get higher rates, they're going to get higher this because they think they don't know what they're talking about. The male part, we start by studying a Cambridge University study that found that men actually start to undergo a physiological depression after they're unemployed for 6 months. A chemical change, because they've been conditioned their whole lives that they should provide and protect.
Breadwinners.
So this boy raises his hand and he says, maybe that's why my father left. And it was, interesting to link the dots. And he said, well, if he can't do the only thing he was supposed to do, maybe he figured we were better off without him. And then a girl started mentioning, like in different animal groups, when the male's taking resources away, they leave. And the kids really saw the social connection to that, which blew my mind. And it stuck with you a little bit.
No, it stuck with me in so many ways. So if you aren't able to, not even just focusing on, you can't take care of your family, if you can't take care of yourself, and if you don't have certain skill sets that are translatable and marketable to certain environments, then you're going to do whatever possible to ensure that you can maintain your life. And what happens with many of our young men and some of our young women, but more so young men, is that if you don't have certain job skills, if you can't market yourself a particular way, if you've been impacted by the justice system and can't be hired and aren't even allowed to be hired in a particular way,
or get housing,
then you're going to do whatever it take to survive. And a lot of this happens to be in ways that may be considered illegal in many different parts of the world, and which just is a kind of a fast way for you to get in the justice system. If you're doing something illegal, then you're going to have to figure out ways to protect yourself, because that black market is real. And if you're competing with somebody else because of a market and there's no kind of regulation for it, the opportunities of you getting injured are a lot higher. We see so many young people who come in, they came in because they were hustling, or the beef that they had, an altercation that they had that led them to the hospital, led them to come to us, purely was all kind of tied to some sort of access to economics that allowed them to take care of themselves. I'm not sure there were other factors that took place, but these are things that are impacting your health and well-being. But also, if you can't be here because you can't feed yourself, you can't feed your kids, your sense of self-worth actually goes down the tubes, which causes your system to become dysregulated. You mentioned increasing depression, which affects your ability to process and take care of your day-to-day responsibilities. A lot of us will have these series of emotions, from depression to anxiety, feeling bewildered or feeling nervous, but once it becomes pathologic and can be harmful once you can't take care of your day-to-day responsibilities. And we're seeing so many people where their day-to-day responsibilities can't be taken care of purely because of the economic situation that they're in, which forces them to make, I don't want to say poor decisions, but the only decisions that they're able to comprehend at that point that can allow them to survive.
People always talk about how a split second can change your whole life and the whole trajectory. Not that you can't ever some things people can't come back from, but I want to talk about the work that you do as an ER physician too, because it has to be difficult to see the things that you see every day and want to be able to do whatever you can, even outside of being a physician, right? When you see so many different things happening and you're like, I wish I could do more to help people, which is why you started KAVI. But I want to talk about how you're able to separate that and just do your job at the base.
That's a great question, because that wasn't always the case. I wasn't always able to separate the work from the activism to my own personal life. I think before I had a family, before I got married, before I had a kid, before my parents started aging, it was easy because I just had time. You got youth on your side, you got time and energy, and I could still stay up for long periods of time, which is kind of a gift, but and stay focused for longer periods of time, which is even a greater gift that's been worked on very hard. But there was a point where everything kind of came tumbling. And in the book, I speak about one of my close friends, Willis. Willis Young, who we call Young, who was one of our intervention team members. He grew up in Bed-Stuy. He lived on the block that I had moved to in 2011. And he was one of the first people I met. Even though he wasn't living there anymore, he was always on the block hanging out. And so we developed this friendship, almost mentor-mentee. And we had just launched programming for KAVI. And I said, we don't have any money, but I would love to have you work with us because I loved how you engaged with people. And, people in New York don't always speak.
Right.
We're
taught not to.
We're taught not to.
Taught growing up.
We're taught we don't speak to people. So but
don't
he had
look at people. Just
don't
mind
look,
your
eye
business.
contact, transient. Don't look for long periods of time. Look to engage and just keep it moving. But he had this magic about how he interacted with people. I said, when we get some money, I want to bring you on. I said, right now we're just doing volunteer stuff. And he said, I got some stuff going on, so I can't really do that kind of work just yet because I'm not ready for it. But we always had these conversations, and eventually he started coming in as a volunteer and started really participating in the sessions. I thought he was there as kind of as a support system for the kids in our school-based program, but he was actually there. He was like, I'm learning stuff in these spaces, and then once we got our first grant money. About 2 years later, in 2013, he was one of our first hirees. And so his job, he was a violence intervention specialist and hospital responder, and his job was to make sure that he intervened with people when they were injured. He provided a lot of support system, talking to them about just doing basic check-ins like, "Yo, are you okay? I know what happened to you. I know this is messed up." I don't want to use language. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to curse on the air, but. He said, he would do these check-ins. And sometimes, because he lived in the Stuy and he was also blood, he knew some of the patients that were coming in. And so that was that thing that what I'm providing is a real benefit to people that are in our circle because I know I can speak the language very different than the docs, than the nurses, and I have the time to be able to do that. And he was brilliant at that job. But a few years later, on my birthday in 2015, my morning wake-up call, I was off that day in the ER, but my morning wake-up call was that he was stabbed multiple times and taken to the emergency department, the same place where he did the intervention work, making sure that people didn't retaliate, making sure that they got a support system and had an advocate from someone who was a credible messenger. But the same place he did these interventions was the same place that he was brought in as a patient. And he was tough, he was strong, he was muscular, but after being stabbed so many different times and repeat blood transfusions, his body couldn't handle the stress, and he wound up dying 2 weeks later in the ICU, the same place that he would also comfort people. And I never shut off, so I was the intersection and the liaison between people on the block who knew and loved him and cared for him, the people from the hospital who same thing, knew, loved, and cared for him, the people from our organization who knew, loved, and cared for him. And I never took a break.
You didn't have time for your own grief.
I didn't have time. I didn't grieve, even like on shifts. Work coming from overnight. I go check on them. Even during shifts, I check on them in the upstairs in the ICU. Even if it was like a couple of minutes, and I was constantly doing that. And when he died, we had an organization because we're still doing this intervention work. And it wasn't until the day of his funeral, which was like maybe a month or 2 months later, that everything just kind of came crashing down. And I was coming in for a shift, I was running late, and I called the ER, said, "Look, I'm running late." The nurse who picked up the phone was somebody that I grew up with, because Brooklyn's just connected in that way. And she said, "You're not going to believe who's here." It was the person who came in and shot multiple times, but he was the brother of another person who I pronounced dead. And the kid who I pronounced dead was a 16-year-old kid who was killed by the police. And so when I go into the room, I didn't sleep that day, because, adrenaline, all these emotions are swirling. So I couldn't even rest before my overnight shift. And the funeral was that late morning, early afternoon. And so I'm already tired. I'm already stressed. I'm already somewhat dysregulated. And I see this guy who shot multiple times, who's stable. And, eventually we kind of realized how we were connected because he met me when his brother had passed. I think he did meet me when his brother passed. And then his mother came in, who recognized me immediately. She said, "I know who you are. You cut your locks." And that point, I was like, shit. I was like, this is I didn't want to have that. I already know that it was all these feelings of guilt and shame because we couldn't keep this kid alive. And but I told this mother that her 16-year-old kid was killed, and I didn't even know at the time that he was killed by law enforcement. And eventually, she looks at me, and she stopped making eye contact with me. And I understood completely why. I would come in the room, give her updates on what was going on with her son, who was a patient, who still needed to have a bunch of diagnostic studies done because of his injuries. But she would ask questions, but she'd just look at me like this, like how we're sitting right now, and she would just look off into the wall. And she had like her grandchild just kind of rocking back and forth and refused to make eye contact. And then after I told her her son was stable, we were going to admit him, she looks at me and she said, "Did my son say anything to you before he died?" And like my body just froze because this is a kid who was like, who came in alive, and he was like mumbling, "Don't let me die," and stuff like that. And then, my body's shaking. And then she says, "Why does this keep happening to my family?" Because she'd also lost another person, another family member to gun violence not long before, but I think maybe a month or 2 months before. And then here her other son is lying on a stretcher who's been shot multiple times. And I couldn't answer it. My body just snapped. Cold sweat, diaphoretic, armpits soaked, hyperventilating. I just had to run out of the room. And I'm used to keeping, I'm pretty calm, but I couldn't regulate. And I had to run to the bathroom, and I'm like, I'm having these dry heaves, and I'm having a panic attack. And I'm like, what the hell is this? I was like, I don't get panic attacks. This is not me. Yeah, I've been nervous before, but I'm the one who's in control. I'm the ER doc. That's what we're taught. We keep things in control. We like Green Berets and like Navy SEALs of medicine, and that's what we do. But now I can't keep myself calm, and I had like 6 or 7 hours left on my shift, and so I'm like, how do I take care of all these other people coming in? And we got other people coming with chest pain and people coming with strokes, and my body's shaking. But because of how we're taught to regulate and how to articulate that we're good or not good, we don't. And so I just had to tense up my body. So if you tense up your body and you stay in motion, people can't see that you're shaking. And then your confidence is maintained and they don't think anything is wrong. And so once somebody thinks something is wrong, then everybody starts to panic. And if you're in that leadership position, you're not allowed that. And so I was having panic attacks, and this was happening repeatedly. Coming to the hospital, going home. Every time I walked to the hospital, it was happening. I'm like, how the hell can this happen? And I'm supposed to be the person in control. Docs aren't supposed to get sick. Healthcare providers aren't supposed to get sick. And now here it is, I'm the patient. And so I started going back to therapy and learning. One, I realized I needed to do something because I'm not going on any medication.
Right.
Because that's just my ego. And check, at least not as much, hopefully not have to go on anything. And then learned about more regulating. And she told me that, you've been taking care of people for so long, and you've been taught to be empathetic, but not really taught to be compassionate. And because of the empathy, you're learning to connect with people through their trauma and through their problems and creating these trauma bonds rather than showing love and showing compassion and really being able to navigate these spaces safely. Not saying that you don't care, but really realizing that you have an objective to do. And it's like, if you can express emotion, but you still have a job. You can't become the problem. You can't be so ingrained that they've entered your complete psyche to the point that it's taken over who you are. And then on top of that, you're not giving yourself periods to recover. You can have trauma, you can have injuries, but you got to recover. Right. You got to have these periods of reflection and processing it. And so, I do a lot of physical activity, judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and those are ways to kind of help regulate and process a lot of the trauma and the stress that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. But it's intentional. I don't eat junk food, and it's not like, oh, I don't want to eat junk and I'm trying to just trying to think I'm better than other people. It's like, no, if I eat a bunch of crap, that means I can't sleep. If I can't sleep, that means I can't be there for my wife and my son. If I can't sleep properly, that means I'm making mistakes when I'm at work. And you're making decisions in the matter of a second that can impact somebody's family member or somebody else's life. And I don't want that. I don't want that on my conscience. You kind of take these steps and you make these pacts with yourself and take these oaths to be responsible and respectful and to care for people, but you can't do that if you're a patient. And so the delineation of wellness really being a lifestyle and something that's a part of who you are, and integrated into every aspect of what you do has to be paramount so that we can continue doing this stuff. That therapist said, I got to keep doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what they always say, put your oxygen mask on first.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
you can save everybody else. And that's what you have to do. Ooh.
Last thing I want to touch on with you, what kind of policy changes do you think need to happen to support this different approach to rehabilitation, and what can we do as individuals?
I think that's a great question. There are two things that come to mind. The first is, and this is more on a federal and a state level, with regards to background checks for firearms. Firearms. Willis was stabbed. And so I don't want people to think that, gun violence is the only thing that people should focus on. But firearms do kill more people than knives because of the caliber of the weapon and the rate in which something can be fired to increase the likelihood of somebody dying. But policies to ensure that background checks that are occurring around the United States, eradicating guns and firearms, that's a whole separate conversation. But on a most basic level, making sure that the laws regarding background checks are something that are universal, regardless of how somebody purchased a gun, or the state or the country in which these things have been purchased. It has to be uniform.
And training.
That has to be loved. I love that. Making sure there's a deal of training, because that's something I've never brought up before. But so thank you. Making sure there's levels of training if you are going to have access to one, making sure that the background checks are universal regardless of who and where they purchase it have to be important. And then the other one is ensuring that people recognize violence as a public health issue. If the State Department, if city and local governments all acknowledge that violence is a public health issue, then that means there can be funding allocated to help improve those situations. And for you have a nonprofit. I know you supported so many different community efforts, and
she has at her place in Detroit.
You have the housing.
Some of the housing is going to help.
That should be ready in a month.
Which is I'm so happy about that, and some of my Detroit people also are very appreciative of that kind of work. But it takes financial backing,
right?
And so you've got to have the resources to be able to do that. But looking at things that impact funding can really change the trajectory of somebody who's doing something very small and grassroots. Just because it's small and grassroots doesn't mean that it's not effective.
Right.
Matter of fact, I feel like they're more effective because they're even more closely connected. But these institutions and these organizations can't thrive unless there's something that's implemented to allow for some sort of sustainability. And the cash flow issue is a very, very important thing.
And that's definitely something they've been working on here, because we talk about like police departments and allocating some of that money towards intervention groups and people who are in the community, people who already do the work on a grassroots level, but they're not getting the funding or money that they should be getting, because people should get paid to do those things.
Absolutely.
And so I do think that is something that's why policy is important. That's why knowing who your local officials are is important, and supporting different people and making sure you let them know this is what we need.
Yeah. If you can make a living wage being in a helping profession, think of how communities are impacted. There's so many people in helping professions who are doing nonprofit work, community work, education, social workers that get so burned out because they can't make a proper living wage to take care of themselves and their family.
Financial stress.
That financial stress, back to what we were talking about. So if you're doing working in a helping profession because that's your calling, but you can't care for your loved ones, that means you're doing extra overtime, which means you can't spend time with them. And these are things that I understood, but now as a parent of a toddler, I realize this stuff even more importantly. You have to be intentional. You have to be completely present when you're caring for somebody else in this capacity, because there's so many outside influences that are there, and you don't want somebody else raising your child. But if you can't, but survivability, that's so important. So we got to have that survival mechanism in place. And so for all the politicians out there and the people who are engaged in policy, please make sure you fund these different programs that are out there that are doing incredible work to allow for them to continue this work.
An election's coming up, and I think between you and us, so everybody's going to go to Amazon and they're going to get your book, Treating Violence: An Emergency Room Doctor's Take on a
Deadly American Epidemic.
Epidemic. You can get that on Amazon. Thank you for being my glasses
Dr.
for
Rob
me.
Gore. I know. She's glasses.
She's my eyes for me all the time. I can't live without this girl. And also, everybody, we have so many free resources on Wealth Wednesdays to help you get that economic piece in place. Go to teamwealthwednesdays.com. Take that pledge. You get weekly newsletters. Follow Wealth Wednesdays on Instagram. There's so much free information. Entrepreneurs, we have our entrepreneurs group. But between the book, Wealth Wednesdays, I thank you for giving us such a powerful segment during Mental Health
something we
Awareness
haven't
Month.
done before, so we appreciate that,
Thank you.
Dr. Rob Gore. And I know how great it has to be if something happens to have you as the ER physician, at least because it's not too often that you'll see somebody that you can feel connected to, and that does help a lot as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Happy Wealth Wednesdays, everybody.
Happy
Thank
Wealth
you.
Wednesdays.
Way up.